listening to you. I know, right?
And then you have that there is always something new. There's always something new you find as you're talking about.
Well, there is, but then there's that sense, did I say that on this show already? Or, you know, some other show, you know, so there's always that kind of concern, you know. Welcome to Behind the Pages. Tessa Hadley is with us today. Tessa lives in London. She is the author of 5 very highly acclaimed novels, and she's here today to talk about The Past. This is a novel about 4 siblings who plan to spend 3 weeks for what is probably going to be their last vacation at the old family home before they have to sell it. Welcome, Tessa.
Lovely to be here.
Let's start by having you tell us a little bit more about your novel. Who are your characters and where do we find them as the novel starts out?
Well, as you say, there are 4 siblings, sort of in young middle age, I guess we call that these days. They're in their 40s. Okay. And they are all urbanites, city dwellers, but they are gathering for the 3 weeks of the novel. And that was one of the things I was really clear about at the beginning when I began writing, that my last novel had covered 50 years. This one was just going to cover 3 weeks. And they've gathered for 3 weeks in the country, partly to be together, but partly to decide whether they're going to keep this old house, which is a lovely but very dilapidated and tumble-down old rectory in the countryside in the west of England. And their grandfather was once a minister there. The house means a lot to them. And in other ways, it's just a burden and they can't really afford to maintain it, and there's not much point in hanging on to it. So that's the sort of backbone or the occasion of the novel, I suppose.
Yeah. And it sort of has a little bit of a few chapters that delve into the past, where we start to see their past through their mother's eyes, and then we come back to them again closer to the end.
Yes, well, this is structurally something that, as I say, when I started out writing, I didn't know was going to happen. I really loved the idea of just sticking to 3 weeks.
Yeah.
And then as I got a certain way into the book, I just knew something about the shape and the rhythm and the timing was a little flat, and I needed something extreme to change that. So all at once, within an hour, one afternoon, I thought, I know what I'm going to do. I'm just going to have one section in the middle of the book where we drop right back 40 or more years.
Yeah.
We actually go back to a very significant moment. We go back to May 1968, when the mother of these 4 siblings, although actually only 3 of them are born in 1968. The mother of these 3 siblings has sort of escaped from her husband and come back to stay with her parents in the country. And we see those adults that we've already, you know, we're exploring their lives and their selves and their passions and their dissatisfactions in our present. And then we suddenly, shockingly, see them as little children, and we see them in formation, as it were, and we see the huge influence on their lives of their mother, who's a very powerful woman. I realised afterwards, I don't think that was my plan, I realised she was the most powerful woman in the book, actually.
She was. Both by her presence and her absence.
By her absence, because in the present of the novel, when they are middle-aged, what we quickly learn is that she died, and she died young. She died of cancer when they were teenagers, more or less. And although that happens very much off stage, and there's not a huge amount of talk about it or chewing it over, but I wanted to feel its shadow, and the shadow of that loss really hanging over their present in all sorts of ways.
And it really does too. You can see that in a lot of the decisions they make. In fact, you know, the very first person we meet is Alice, who is just arriving at the house with one of her ex-boyfriend's teenage son. She sort of gets there and doesn't have her key, so there's a little bit of a small, you know, to-do about that, but nothing big. And we find out that she has invited her ex-boyfriend's son just sort of spontaneously. Even though she had defined this as a family-only vacation. Does she tend to be impulsive like that?
And she does, and regret it, as she immediately does when she arrives there with this 20-year-old and suddenly realizes, the way you do, he's going to be bored, and I'm going to feel old because he's bored. So that's very Alice, both the generous mistake of asking him, and then the panicking, slightly selfish regret.
Yeah.
And also, I mean, it really does open the first sentences that she arrives there, they get to the front door and she's forgotten her key. And I wouldn't have put that as the first sentence if it hadn't been itself a key to her character. And then they skirt the outside of the house and they peer in through the windows, and it's a good way of kind of building the potency of the house in imagination for those four.
Right.
Whereas the 20-year-old boy is, you know, just looks a bit faded and sad and indifferent to him.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I wondered too, though, once, you know, because this is revealed pretty quickly about their mother die. Not only did their mother die, but we also know pretty early on that their father abandoned them after his wife passed away. So I wondered if that sort of, in Alice's mind, has changed her definition a bit of family.
Well, they don't seem to be terribly good at making families. This generation. I mean, the brother Roland, he turns up with his third wife, so he's been through 3 marriages, and there's something about him as a man that makes you feel he likes to keep himself apart. He isn't easy with intimacy. In fact, he says at some point his idea of an ideal marriage is 2 people utterly unknown to each other, you know. 2 of the sisters, Alice and the oldest sister, Harriet, neither of them have children. And although Harriet does have a man friend, they live apart. It's not a very charged relationship.
Right.
The baby of the family has got a marriage, although her husband is sometimes unsatisfactory and doesn't turn up. And she has got kids. So you know, it's not a fatality for that family. But I'm sure we do look for that terrible teenage crisis of the mother's death and the father's hopelessness and terrible abandonment for some sort of explanation.
Yeah, or sort of a redefinition of who is family. Are these the people who you're close with? You know, like for instance, or Kasim, is it Kasim or
Kazim? Yeah.
Kasim. Okay. So then we next look at see a few things through his eyes, which are his own question of what am I going to do here for the next few weeks, and is he going to be bored? I mean, he tells us that he accepted her invitation basically to get away from his mother, who was pressuring him about his studies. But if we could ask him a second question and say, well, then, you know, was there anything more to it? What would he say?
I think in writing him, I very much had a sense of a strongly defended young man who was more vulnerable than he allowed to appear. On the surface, easily bored, rather dismissive. They have arguments about politics, and he's scornful of the sisters' sort of dreary leftism and optimism. He thinks they're hopelessly naive about economics. Underneath it, what we learn about him is that his dad, if you like, I don't want to imply that everybody has shadows over them, but I guess that's what the past is, isn't it?
Right.
The past is the shadows, the things we carry out of the past into our present. So his dad is a great, big, masculine man who has had innumerable women, and sometimes that little boy, there is a bit when he says, sometimes I had to put headphones on so that I couldn't hear my dad making love to the girls. And there's been lots of drugs, and his dad is a political activist, and he's obviously a dynamic and charismatic character. And somewhere this odd, unyielding, ungiving young man has defined himself against that powerhouse of a father, rather like my 4 siblings have helplessly been defined against their powerhouse of a mother, actually, because it isn't only, it's the mother's absence, but it's that specific mother. She's strong, and she's sort of fully, physically, passionately female in a way that none of her daughters are quite so wholeheartedly womanly.
That's true, right. Kasim is also, you know, I mean, I sort of did get the sense that he really likes being part of this family, but he wouldn't ever admit that to us if we asked him. You know,
I mean, he likes it all the more once
Yeah.
Molly turns up.
Sure.
Because
right.
Molly is Roland, the brother's 16-year-old daughter from his first marriage.
Yeah.
And Kasim has no idea that she's coming, and he thinks, oh, he's heard tell of her, but she'll be another little nuisance, a little child. And then suddenly this attractive, nubile, enigmatic, silent, smiling girl turns up, and of course she does seriously add extra interest to the holiday. Whether he'd have stayed if she hadn't, I think you're right. You know that in fact that warm, scatty, slightly hopeless family in its shabby surroundings is enveloping and comforting for Kasim. It is, in a way he absolutely has no idea that it is.
Yes, and in being with someone like Alice, who we know from page 1, she's not going to be pressuring him about his studies. That's not who she is. You know? So he'll really actually have a little time to just be.
To just be.
Yes.
To just be.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yes, I think we get a glimpse of some secret shames that he has about himself when we look into his bedroom in the house, you know, not his bedroom really, but the one he's staying in, and Molly's bedroom, and hers is a rich mess of stuff, clothes, makeup, old plates with dried on food, the hairdryer. His is almost frighteningly austere, with very little in it, including no books, for all he's pretending to study, and you know, everything neatly folded, and that's a little chilly glimpse into something a bit sad inside that boy.
It is. It is. Alice realizes that her oldest sister, Harriet, has arrived ahead of them and has gone out for a walk. Alice tells Kasim that don't worry about the keys because Harriet wouldn't have forgotten her. She never forgets anything. Does Alice think that this is an admirable quality?
Oh dear, does one think that one's sister's traits are maddening, admirable? The answer is both. Isn't it? And that they have, the two of them have a history. It's obvious. I mean, I think I say somewhere, it had been peaceful when Harriet stopped hating Alice. You know, there's bad black blood between them, as well as in the end, finally, you know, something really saving for both of them in their relationship and in their love. No, Alice is impatient, of course, because she is scatty and spontaneous and emotional and very interested in her appearance and clothes. And Harriet, who long ago was a real revolutionary. I mean, not she didn't plant bombs or anything, but she printed leaflets, that sort of drearier kind of revolutionary.
She went to jail for her beliefs.
She did, and she lay down in front of cruise missiles and things like that, and then stopped and kind of had a big void where that commitment and that dream of a different future had been. And she's a very locked up person. And I suppose one of Alice's impatiences with Harriet is that locked upness.
Yes.
Funny that we're talking about keys again, isn't it? When the book began with a key, but we feel that Harriet at the beginning of the novel is closed in and everything's closed down, and then of course something absolutely catastrophic happens to her, which changes all of that.
Yes. It does. I mean, because birthplace makes a big difference in terms of everyone's, I mean, in real life and in the novel. You know, Harriet was the oldest one. She did have to take care of the younger ones when her mom died. And so the younger ones both appreciate and resent that, because I'm sure she was bossing them around before she was really old enough to do that.
Exactly, exactly. And even when we go back into the past to 1968, when she's 8 or 9, we hear her mother saying, "Come on, you have to be my sensible girl. You have to be a big girl." In a slightly oblivious way. I think we're supposed to have learned as parents not to do that any longer. But I think in 1968 people were doing all kinds of terrifying stuff to their children, and that was the least of it.
I agree. So Harriet mentions that she is only staying for one of the planned 3 weeks. What is Harriet's reason for not actually changing her schedule to stay for the whole 3 weeks? she seems to love the home. I mean, the grandparents' home and the house.
Yeah, she loves it like they all do, and it means a lot to her. But there are several moments in the book when we feel the sheer difficulty that Harriet has with coexisting with other people.
Yes, that's exactly.
There's a moment when the brother has turned up with his new wife and with Molly, and she arrives back from a walk. She loves to walk alone for miles and miles through this well-known, beautiful countryside. She arrives back, their car is there, their luggage is sort of spilling out of the car. She can hear the voices in the back garden. And whereas many people would then hurry keenly around to meet the new arrivals, she feels this huge inertia, this reluctance. It's so painful to enter that peopled world. And I think what she's thought at first is, I can bear it. I can more than bear it. I will love to go back for a week, but 3 weeks, really? No, a week is as much as I can before I need my solitude back.
That's exactly what I was thinking too, that she loves her family, she loves the place, the peacefulness, but she loves her solitude even more.
Yeah. Well, there's a sort of little issue about Alice in her slight oblivious selfishness that she has, having ended up so that Harriet has to have a room which has 2 doors on it. It all becomes quite significant, actually.
Yes.
But the very sense that she can't quite shut herself off in the total privacy that obviously, at least at the beginning of the novel, is her preferred option.
It is. I mean, even when she describes her, or we hear about her relationship, it's 2 people living in the same house.
Actually, living separately in separate houses, even.
Oh,
they
okay.
even
I think
live
I missed
together.
that. Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. So Fran arrives next with her children and immediately kind of sets to work on packing groceries, getting started to get dinner ready. Alice feels a little guilty that her sister is, sort of doing all the work. So what does Alice do about that?
Pick some flowers in the garden to put out on the tables and put out in all the bedrooms. Sort of characteristic. I mean, she does. I think we do have her cooking supper later, so it's not appalling. But that sort of characteristic that Harriet, when she arrived, would go out for a walk all by herself.
Yes.
Fran would start unpacking the enormous amount of shopping she's bought and start cooking supper. And Alice would be picking flowers and actually then pulling an old children's book out of the bedroom that she takes for herself, which was their mother's bedroom, and she doesn't really ask whether she can have it. There's a little hesitation, but it's not convincing. And starts dreaming her way back into this, this children's book, and through the children's book into her childhood and even her mother's childhood. And I deliberately, I think, apart from, I mentioned the grandmother's reading at some point, but the only books I seriously mention are children's books. I kind of, because this house in some way for me, it stands very profoundly for their childhood, and it even stands for a kind of English childishness, if that's not pushing it too far. And I wanted a feeling that, in a sense, these 4 attractive, interesting people are nonetheless slightly stuck in something a little bit sentimental and a little bit nostalgic, and they really do kind of need to put their children's books away and read something grown-up. And of course that's symbolic. I'm not really saying they never read any grown-up books, but I wanted to sort of just underpin that.
Oh yes, because we see Alice start, which doesn't give away that much of the plot, but that she doesn't just look through a book, but she starts rereading.
And when the rain comes later on in the novel, she has the 2 kids in bed with her on the long rainy days, and they reread the whole of a Dr. Dolittle, which one of the books from my childhood. So yes, no, this is one of the things I love about Alice, and I'm sort of doing this again with the new character in my new novel. I love people who, in our pushy, busy, fraught, frantic, email-assaulted world, are rather good at being lazy. I love her leisureliness and the sense that she isn't pushing a great path through the world, that she's drifting. And I kind of think maybe that's a gift, that it's lost a little bit.
Yeah, no, she's not headed for the first, to the gate, which is the only place where you can get internet or phone
No, well, she sort of drifts up there eventually, but
it's not her priority.
It's not
by any means. Yeah. In fact, I think the only one that's a priority for are the kids.
Yes, absolutely, yes. Molly has to get up there.
Yeah. So Fran is quite upset about the fact that her husband Jeff has deliberately, or we assume deliberately, forgotten that he was supposed to join them on this vacation. And she said that's the last straw.
Yeah.
Does Alice believe her?
No, Alice says, I've heard that before. Though
Right.
she's careful and tactful. She doesn't say, oh, you're joking, you know, I don't believe you. She takes it seriously, because all of those little pussyfooting, kind of treading on eggshells games that siblings play with each other, knowing each other's sensitive spots, or in fact, I say somewhere, sometimes not remembering those when you're apart, and then the moment you're back close together again, you think, oh yes, gosh, she always does that, doesn't she? I'd forgotten that. And so she tactfully doesn't say, yeah, you're always saying you're leaving Jeff, but you won't really. But we kind of get a strong sense that this is a pattern between Fran and Jeff.
Right. And she also wisely doesn't start saying anything bad about Jeff either. Exactly. She just kind of steps back.
No, that's one of the first rules in the book of sibling behavior, is that when your sibling is complaining about their partner, don't join in.
Right, because they're likely to stay with the partner, and that will come back to haunt you.
Exactly.
But that's true in life.
It's
with
really
your friends
true
too.
in life. Yes.
Yes. So all of the siblings seem, very sentimental about the house. What is it specifically for each of them? What does it represent for each of them?
Well, I suppose, in a very literal way, they loved their grandparents. Their grandparents are very interesting people anyway, and their grandparents also became very prominent in their lives, particularly after their mother's death and father's disappearance. So there's all of that. Then very important times have been spent there. It's formative. But again, I also wanted to get the feeling of how it's a very English thing, although I have a strong feeling that you have an American equivalent, that somewhere at the back of our psyche, we all think we have a home in the country. Yeah. However little our lives have really been there, however little we really would like it if we did live there, it's like some sort of nest. And I think there's a sort of combination of a very particular family story that's meant this house embodies something very important for them. But it's more than that. It's a very English nostalgia again.
And probably for them, it was the one stable place of their childhood. Yeah. Because even prior to their mother's death, it sounds like their life was a bit chaotic.
It does. It does. We learn about that in the middle section when we go back to 1968, and we have a sense of I mean, it was 1968, and as their dad keeps saying to their mum on the telephone, everything's up for grabs. Yeah. Everything's changing. This is not the same world now. Of course, part of the effect of dropping that into the middle of a longer book is irony. Yes. In that it looks as if actually maybe everything wasn't turned upside down quite as one felt it was going to be in 1968. Yes. But it was a turbulent time, and I really wanted to get the thrill of that turbulence in the 1968 section. Yes. And funnily enough, the grandmother, the vicar's wife, who is another dreamy person who goes off into little blanks and thinks, oh, where have I just been for 10 minutes? Yeah. Actually, when her daughter says, I'm leaving my, is it right to say this is a bit of a spoiler, but not really, I'm leaving my husband, I'm bringing the children back, and her mother says, don't come back here. Don't come back here. Your life is not here. I would be where things are happening. So the last person you would expect to be giving that advice actually feels, do you know, coming back to the nest is bad for you. Yeah, yeah. Go out and have the life. Which was her mother being a mother, really. Yeah, being a wise mother, because the first of her instincts was to say, I'd love to have you here. I'd love it. Yes. But the second one was better. Yes. Absolutely. One of the things they're going to discuss while they're there is whether they need to sell the house. Is it really, if we could ask Alice, would she tell us that this was a discussion they needed to have? I mean, was there any question? Oh, they're very funny, those huge decisions, aren't they? Which you approach them and you refuse to know what the outcome is going to be, and yet really, if you had an outside arbiter, I think we know. I think we know they're going to sell this house. Yes, well, none of them really. None of them really have the commitment or the money or the need for it. Yes. But I still think probably psychologically that slow, familial, leisurely circling of the
Yes.
decision is the right way to come at it, actually. They shouldn't have just done it by email. That would
No.
have been awful.
Right.
They needed, it's like a ritual, it's like a ceremony. Something is ceremonially put to bed, at,
Right.
you know, at the end of the book when they do decide to sell.
Yeah. Well, sometimes too with Alice, I sort of got the sense that she's the kind of person that's kind of waiting for Prince Charming to come. So she would procrastinate that decision a bit because she has that kind of wish somebody's going to come rescue her. You know, that might happen. Oh, she's at the point in her life where she's kind of realizing Prince Charming may not be there. You know? I mean, at any point for, you know.
I think that's what I like about her, is that dreamy readiness for the next adventure, which will probably be a man. But a kind of, there is, Alice is tougher than you might at first think.
Yes.
And there's a sort of realism about her as well.
Yes.
And at
That's
the end
one
of
of the
book,
things I
her
like.
realism
Yeah,
comes
and I
into
like that
play.
about the novel, that I mean, well, all of their characters, we get to know them better from our first glance, and this is true in, you know, in life. With when we meet people, sometimes your first impression isn't actually the real, who the person really is. That there's a lot of other facets to them, and that's what I thought was particularly striking about Alice, is that who she is when we first meet her is really not who she is, and we get to know her a lot better by the end of the novel, and she can step up when she needs to.
In what I often feel about writing characters in fiction is that actually, in order to make them work in fiction, you have to simplify. People in life are so complicated and so multifaceted and contradictory that they almost don't work if you don't. You have to sort of like being a painter, and instead of meticulously copying each bit with photographic realism, you actually choose a few strong brushstrokes to bring out the essentials. Well, that's kind of what you're doing when you put a person into fiction, because real people are ungraspable. They will always endlessly say the opposite to what you thought they were going to say, and do the last thing you'd have thought they would do, and reveal resilience where you thought they'd be weak, and fear where you thought they'd be brave. And so funnily enough, I mean, it would be awful not to pay homage to that complexity and have complex characters in a novel, but the truth is that one does a little bit of simplification. Life is more complicated even than novels. I think that's true.
I'm
that's
sure
half true.
you know, I'm sure that it is. We have just a few minutes left, so I'd like to just sort of step back a bit and ask you, what gave you the idea to write this particular novel? What did you want to say?
I think partly, often one's writing slightly in reaction to the book before, and I had written Clever Girl. My last novel was a long episodic narrative of a woman's whole life, from being quite a little girl to being 50. I sort of didn't know at first where I would end it, and then 50 seemed a magical number, if you like. So I think it was a reaction to that, and a feeling I would just do something intensely small, 3 weeks, and that was all.
Well, you did it very well, and I want to thank you for being on the show today. Unfortunately, we are now out of time, so, but it was a pleasure talking with you. From the staff of 22 City View, you've been watching Behind the Pages. I'm Diane Goshgarian. And thank you so much for being here. It was, I really could have gone on and on about the other. We didn't even really get into Roland, but that's okay. We need to leave something for them to read about.
Exactly.
Too, so
it's always a bit tricky to know whether which things to give away and which